Hello and welcome to NewsClick, this program with real news. We have with us today Professor Vijay Prashad, who is, as you know, well-known commentator on various issues. Vijay, good to have you with us.
Great to be here.
Vijay, we have had the recent bombings in Istanbul. It's very clear now that this is the Caucasus group, as it were, which has now been known to have aligned with the ISIS or IS or Daesh, as it is called. Do you think it means a change between what Turkey was doing earlier with a tacit backing of ISIS and now ISIS coming back to bomb the Istanbul airport?
Well, it's difficult to say exactly what happens with these groups because, ISIS doesn't lay out the nature of its relationship either with the Turkish government. Turkish government doesn't talk about its relationship. So it's hard to say what has changed. But what one can intuit is that certainly we know that since about 2012, if not earlier than that, if not from 2011, the Turkish government was running a porous border. It in fact encouraged people to land at Mardin airport, to land at other airports, Gaziantep airport in southeastern Turkey, and take buses across the border to join various rebel outfits inside Syria. Now, of course, some of these people, particularly the big surge of people from Libya and Tunisia, went and joined ISIS. One of the contradictory things, Prabir, of the American bombing of ISIS is when the Americans started bombing the ISIS area, many of these people who weren't fully committed to this particular struggle turned around, went back to Mardin, back to Gaziantep, and took flights home. Some of them went to Istanbul. I mean, one of the curious things, several years ago, a CIA person told me that in 2001 and 2, when the Americans went and bombed Afghanistan, he said we bombed with such force as if we were using a hammer to smash a vial of mercury, and the mercury spread all over. In a sense, this is what the bombing had done. It had sent people back. Now, the Turkish government, I think, didn't anticipate what the CIA calls blowback.
But why you are saying this, there's the other part of it, that the Turkish and the CIA relations with Caucasus as an anti-Russian move. So post-Afghanistan, there was this jihadi outfits active in the Caucasus. Umar Dukayev, all the Belsen school attacks and all of that. And there's a lot of literature to indicate that they were backed by the Americans, who thought that's a good way to keep Russia on the boil, as it were, on the back foot. And a lot of this really also is an axis with Turkey. That in fact the Caucasus relations with the CIA was operative through Turkey. The person who's been named, Ahmad Chetaev, he has been given, as you know, sanctuary in Austria. He's got, though he's recognized as a terrorist in Russia, they've asked for his extradition and they were refused. Austria gave him sanctuary. So all of this would indicate that there is a deeper Turkish Caucasus link that has been active, aimed at Russia and also aligned later on to the ISIS that has developed. So do you think this axis is likely to change, A, with the now letter that Erdogan has sent to Putin,
Moscow, yeah,
and Putin's immediate response, lifting sanctions, etc. Do you think this indicates a changed Turkish relationship with these groups and therefore the bombing, or is it something which is unpredictable by the nature of this group?
See, it can't be. I appreciate you putting the longer story. You can even go further back. It may not just be 2003. The Dagestan, Chechnya, these areas have been under pressure from Saudi influence from the 60s and 70s, fully backed by the CIA, in order to put pressure on the Soviet Union. One of the reasons they created the World Muslim League in 1962 was to build resistance to the idea that communism can flourish in countries where there are Muslims. That was one of their big things. So those places, in fact, if I was to take a map and plot the areas where the World Muslim League in the 60s and 70s operated, and look today at the so-called reservoirs of extremism from, Philippines out to Dagestan, the map is very similar. It's the countries from the 60s that have been, in a way, bred to enter into this kind of machination that are continuing to bear fruits when you need them, that is against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 70s, perhaps against Syria in the 2012 period onward. It bears fruit, but then it is unpredictable. I mean, it cannot be. You see, that day, the Erdogan government did a smart thing. It normalized with Israel, and it had this new equation with Russia. Now, these fellows acted so quickly. That had to have taken some time to prepare. So I think that there is some level of unpredictability. I don't think they were exactly reacting to the new equation with Russia. There is unpredictability. The Turks have this ambition and have had for a long time. It goes up to even Ukraine, where there are some Turkmen populations. And there is a complexity and contradictory nature of the entanglements. Just as Syria is an utterly contradictory entanglement. On the one side, they facilitated the growth of ISIS, then they are against the Kurds, then the Americans tell them, you have to fight ISIS. Well, if they do that, then they'll have to join the Kurds, so they start bombing the Kurds. There is a sense of contingency there.
Yeah. Agreed that the Syria map is a complex one.
Very complicated.
With each side having more than one alliance, and then these allies also being against each other. So that's a patchwork alliance come a competition in Syria. But leaving that out, just looking at the Caucasus, Turkey, American links, you've talked about Soviet Union, and the interesting part is it continues post-Soviet Union as a containment of Russia and breakup of Russia link. Part of it is also the pipeline issue, that they had the BTC pipeline, they wanted to really block the Grozny pipeline. Leaving all those things aside, the reality is that the Americans never were serious about giving Russia a place at the high table. As Russia thought it would get after Soviet Union has fallen, they thought they would be able to make up with the West. And it's very clear that the whole containment of Russia, breaking up of Russia with the Caucasus link continued, with Turkey as a very important player. And once it morphs into the ISIS in Syria, and the Chechens, as you know, have a number of groups operating in Syria, that this has become a major issue. And you've talked about the Turkmenistan issue, the Turkoman population, as it were, which is there in large parts of Central Asia, don't speak Turkic. They might have a Turkic language base at one point, but they really speak different languages. And when Turkey talks of Turkmen's population and in Syria, they're really also talking about Chechens, Dagestanis, and so on. So this has been a much longer play, isn't it?
I mean, it's not only a much longer play, but there are two other aspects. You laid it out very well. There are these thorn in the side of Moscow sort of behavior, not only in NATO expanding eastward, beyond the borders of Germany, which is a violation of the Baker-Shevardnadze agreement, for the unification of Germany. Not only is there this eastward expansion of NATO, but there's also been this thorn in the side of Russia, of Moscow, through the Caucasus here, Central Asia there. Let's face it. What the West gets away with is at every moment it acts as if it's reasonable. Historically, people say, yes, of course they did the coup in Iran, we know that, but now they're different. At every juncture, as history progresses, these things get revealed. And then people say, okay, yeah, that happened in the past, but it's not happening in the present. Well, of course, it's been happening right along. You don't have one of the largest intelligence networks if you're not using it. And this is how they used it. Fair enough. That's one aspect. But the other aspect is the aspect of Turkey. I mean, Turkey, despite the change from the regime of the Republicans and the military, that era, the change to the AKP party, meaning Erdogan's sort of Islamist, Muslim Brotherhood-esque party, despite this change, they are still cold warriors. I mean, Erdogan, for instance, was very eager for the Turkish government to allow George Bush to use the landmass of Turkey from which to bomb Iraq in 2003. And it's only because his parliament voted against him that he then insisted on a second vote. What prevented Turkey from being essentially the aircraft carrier was that the Kurds had an objection etc. The Iraqi Kurds. But they are by instinct cold warriors, the Turks. I mean, this is how the establishment or the apparatus has functioned. They were the front line against the Soviet Union for several decades. The placing of missiles, etc. in Turkey, this was an issue. So why does one expect Turkey not to be fundamentally cold warrior-ish when it comes to these new 21st century wars? Yes, certainly they are operating now. The blowback from these things teaches nobody a lesson. Nobody seems to want to learn the lesson. You would have thought that the very creation of Al-Qaeda, which then came to threaten Saudi Arabia, would have sent a message to people in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, maybe it's not a good idea to export our fellows overseas to go and learn how to fight because they create problems at home. It taught them nothing. Then they did it again. Then they'll do it again. The lessons of history are not being learned by any of these people.
Coming to this issue of now Turkey, it's very clear that Turkey has made overtures to Russia even before the bombing. Do you think now the correlation between Russia, Turkey is going to change vis-a-vis Syria? Particularly the kind of open and porous borders it has had with ISIS, both with respect to flow of oil, paying for that oil in different ways, facilitating it. Those long pictures we have had of long truck lines going to carrying oil, plus the fact that supplies have been flowing in the reverse direction. Do you think that's going to stop now? Or do you think that it will still continue in a contradictory way? Okay, we support Turkomans, but we will not support the ISIS kind of way, and we'll fight the Kurds wherever they are.
If you run and fall against barbed wire, the most difficult thing to do when you're stuck in barbed wire is to get out of the barbed wire. You might remove one barb, but then in that position you'll get stuck in another. And in a sense, Turkey's problem now is that it is basically completely jammed onto barbed wire. It'll have a very hard time extricating itself from its adventure inside Syria. And perhaps the Russian thing is a little bit of attempting to extricate itself. Perhaps. I don't think it's going to be easy for Turkey to walk away from the mess that it has been part of producing, perhaps centrally part of producing. But that's the first thing. Second thing is, you see how Turkey has played around with its relationship with Israel. They cut a deal, then they get angry. I don't think the Russians should assume from this overture, this letter, this lifting of sanctions, that this means that everything is fine with Turkey. There's an erratic nature in the way the Turks deal with certain powers. The way they've dealt with Israel, I think, should be instructive to the Russians. That this is perhaps, and maybe the fact that they were both so-called normalized on the same day, should have sent a message to Moscow that don't get any ideas here, because after all, 1 minute we are shaking hands with the Israelis, the next minute we are abusing them at Davos. So I think that it would be silly to assume that this lifting of sanctions is nothing if not a comma. It's definitely not a semicolon and certainly not a full stop.
Thank you, Vijay, for this discussion on Turkey. And for our viewers, Vijay's new book, which is The Death of the Nation and the Future of the Arab Revolution, is just out from Leftward Books. It has a chapter on Turkey, and it also has a chapter on Syria, which is what we are going to discuss in the next segment.